We're continuing our series this morning on finding God in the midst of the chaos, life interrupted. And I'll have to say to you that when I looked through my New Testament to look for stories that illustrate life interrupted, finding God in the midst of the chaos, and there are lots and lots of them, this particular story we're going to read from John kind of rose to the very top. The reason is that this is a story about a woman. It's a familiar story to some of you. She's been caught in adultery, and her life has not just been interrupted. It's about to be the ultimate interruption. Her life is about to be taken by the righteous, or could we say the self-righteous people of Jerusalem. And so it's kind of the perfect story in a lot of ways in terms of the concept of life interrupted. You'll see here it's the perfect story when we talk about chaos. Let me just give you a hint. Those of you who are really working at reading the New Testament, when you read Mark, Matthew, and Luke, these are known as the synoptic gospels, and they have a lot of stories that they share in common with one another. The Gospel of John is different, and most of the stories in John are singular. Only John tells those stories, and this is one of them. We find it here in the 8th chapter of John's Gospel. There's kind of an introductory. The way John's Gospel is put together in terms of chapters and verses is a bit odd. You'll see that as you read through it. It doesn't always make sense. So there's kind of an introductory verse and then the story about this woman. Then each of them went home talking about those who had come to hear Jesus, while Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. They're hoping, because they knew him to be a gracious and forgiving person, they're hoping to find him in conflict with the Jewish law. Notice what Jesus did. It's an extraordinary story, really. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. Not a word at this point. When they kept on questioning him, the questions keep coming at, the chaos, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And then once again, he bent down in silence and began to write on the ground. When they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of the biggest mistakes we can make when we read the New Testament or the Bible at all is to think that somehow, this is such a special book of sweet stories about Jesus. We're going to read some about the teaching, the preaching, but the miracles, it's really a different kind of book. And it's not hard if you start reading the book in that way, the Bible in that way, to read it in a way in which it is really different or separate from real life itself. And that happens with this story a lot. I mean, I've read this story dozens and dozens of times. And it's really easy to read this story, to skim through it and say, "Oh, yeah. This is a great reminder of the fact that Jesus is a forgiving and gracious person. It's a great reminder of the importance of grace and forgiveness over judgment." And then to skip on to the next story. And that's not wrong. It's just that we leave out a lot of really good details in this story if you do that. Now, the story itself is kind of abbreviated. It doesn't give us a lot of details. But if you'll use your imagination when you read your New Testament, you can fill in a lot of the details about what took place here. Here's what we know. There was a woman who had been caught in adultery, and everybody knew about it. So what had started out as a private love affair between this woman and one other man had now become public news. And everybody knew about it. And that changes things, doesn't it? That changes things. This time when I read the story, and I'll just share this with you, and I'll invite you to think along with me, especially if you grew up in a small town. in the panhandle of Oklahoma or in West Texas or someplace in Ohio or upper state New York. If you've ever lived in a small town, you're going to understand this. I got to thinking about, because I have a couple of two or three small towns, and I got to thinking about this particular story and what this looks like in real life. This is what it looks like when it takes place in your small town or mine. A private affair becomes public. This woman is having an affair with somebody's husband. And by the way, it's a patriarchal story. It always comes to us that way, but we know that the woman wasn't any more guilty than the man. Two people involved. And at first, nobody really knows about it. But then all of a sudden, word leaks out. And in the towns that I grew up in, it only took 24 hours, maybe 48 hours at most, for everybody in town to know about it. The only people in the small town that I grew up that wouldn't have known about an affair like this that became public are the ones who got all of their news only from the newspaper. And of course, that was no one. Because we got our news at places like the barbershop, right? So you go into the barbershop, sit down, you're going to get a shave and a haircut. It doesn't make any difference whether you want to hear about this story or not. This is the story you're going to hear about, right? And the gossip is flying. If you go to the beauty parlor, this is the only thing anybody is talking about. If you go to Alice's Cafe at 6:30 in the morning for your coffee group, this is what everybody's going to be talking about. When you go again to the Dairy Queen at 3 o'clock in the afternoon for afternoon coffee, it's the same story. This is going all the way, all around town. Nobody talks about anything else. And of course, we know that by this time, people have started taking sides. Because this isn't just about one woman and one man anymore, is it? It's about another husband and another wife. It's about children on both sides of the family. It's about brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and cousins. If you've lived in one of those towns where almost everybody's related to one another, you know what I'm talking about? It's about friends. And everybody at this point has started taking sides. I lived in a town once where something like this happened, and people started carrying guns, and life was taken. It's a perfect example of what happens when there is chaos that has been created by our own bad decisions, isn't it? We can make a bad decision now and then, and look, we've all made bad decisions. We can make a bad decision now and then, and maybe it doesn't turn into chaos. But so often, one bad decision leads to another bad decision. And it's like that rock, that pebble's thrown into the pond and the ripples, you know. It's what I call the cascading of bad decisions. One decision leading to another. The brothers, the sisters, the friends get involved. Mistakes are made. Guns are carried. Life is taken. And so in this particular case, we're looking at a life that has been interrupted. We're looking at lives that have been interrupted. And we're looking at the potential ultimate interruption of a woman being stoned to death. Additionally, we're looking at the chaos that is created in the lives of families and in the life of this community by a bad decision that led to more bad decisions, the cascading of bad decisions. Now, I'm looking at you. I can't read your expression this morning. Everybody's staying pretty neutral on this, but we know, don't we? I mean, you don't have to break the 8th commandment in order to make bad decisions and have that cascade of consequences running throughout your family or your community. We've all done it. I don't know why I've been thinking about the holidays here recently, but I have. I guess maybe the change in weather or whatever. And I was thinking this weekend about a number of years ago when we were having Thanksgiving dinner with my wife's family. I grew up, you've heard the story lots if you've been around. I grew up with 2 brothers, and it was always pretty exciting at my home, a little chaotic. My wife grew up with 3 sisters, and it was really different for me when I started going to have dinner with her family because everybody got along. It was just really peaceful. There were no fights. And I remember a number of years ago, we were having Thanksgiving dinner, and Bonnie, who is Bobby's youngest sister, said, you know, I was reading an article in a magazine about family feuds. And she said, this is unbelievable to me. It said that a lot of people these days do not get together as families for either Thanksgiving or Christmas because somebody always says something, it leads to a fight, and it just becomes so disruptive that there are a lot of families that have just decided not to have Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner anymore. And I remember saying to her, yeah, that's the way it is in my family, but we always kind of looked forward to it. And I can think about, tons of where you're sitting across the table and you just make one little insinuation, little comment. Before long, people are crawling across the table, fists flying. But it's a perfect example, I think, you see, of the fact that it doesn't take breaking the 8th commandment to create a series of bad decisions that create chaos in our lives. And here's the issue. Whenever we do it, we do so by putting ourselves at the center of things. We put ourselves at the center of the world rather than putting God at the center. You stop and think about it. You just spend some time contemplating this. I have, and I'll tell you that nearly every bad decision I ever made, big bad decision, little bad decision, it doesn't make any difference. Every bad one I ever made was because of my pride or my narcissism. I just put myself at the center of things. And that leads to a chaotic life, and sometimes to difficult or bad, occasionally, tragic consequences. I want to show you a picture here. I found this picture on the internet. There are a lot of pictures. You can Google woman caught in adultery. You can find a lot of pictures. This is the one that pictured the scene I thought the best. If you'll notice, this is what happens. There is this crowd all around. The whole city's involved. And surely there are relatives and in-laws there. And then there's the woman caught in adultery and shame. And then there's the preacher there. Not Jesus. Whoever this person is, the preacher. Think about how this would have played out in your town when the preacher gets involved. Almost every preacher I know of would have used an occasion like this to preach a sermon. Grab the Bible and say, this is what can happen to you. I've been to more than a few small town funeral services where somebody died of an accident because they were drinking or an overdose, or you know the stories. And some preacher got up and said, this is what it can happen to you if you don't come down and join my church today. Preacher throwing gasoline on the fire. But if you look at this picture, what you'll notice is that it's not the preacher in the center of the circle, it is Jesus. It is Jesus. And he's very quiet. And suddenly, Jesus becomes the calm in the midst of the storm. There's another story in the New Testament about that. You know that. Disciples out there in the boat, the storms. It's like today. It's really rainy, storms, lightning. And Jesus walks out and calms the storm. That's what happens. And it's not because of anything that Jesus does or says. It's because of the presence of Jesus. Look at this picture. It is the presence of Jesus in the midst of this chaos. And suddenly everything quiets down. And then Jesus, rather than preaching a sermon, turns to this woman and says, has anyone condemned you? And she says, no. He says, neither do I. Go and sin no more. It's a remarkable story. Have you ever thought about the fact that Jesus doesn't condemn you? That the presence of Jesus in your life starts with the presence of Jesus in your life in this moment. And for Jesus, it's not about what has already happened. It's about what's going to happen. It is the presence of Jesus who comes and transforms rather than condemns. That's what the story is all about. When we find ourselves in the midst of a cascade of bad decisions and chaos surrounding us, the first thing we should do is get out of the middle of the circle and invite Jesus quietly into that space. And remember that it's not about what has happened. It's about what will happen because of the transformation that takes place when God is a part of our lives. So let me just finish by pushing a point that has become of increasing importance to me. It's what I call daily spiritual practice. One of the things we can do is when we find ourselves in the midst of a bunch of bad cascading decisions is that we can invite Jesus in at that point. But the other thing that we can do is invite Jesus in earlier than that. Like every single day. If you have a child or a grandchild, I maintain that your life can be transformed by the simple act of doing nothing more than asking a child to say grace before a meal. Because that is the moment when you invite Jesus into the center of the circle. Daily spiritual practice is when we look at the day and decide whether it's going to be our day or God's day. Daily spiritual practice is how we choose God and peace and tranquility rather than chaos.